Hi, everybody. I'm Dan Wells. I write horror, fantasy, and science fiction, and I talk about games on the internet. Today we're talking about another Conan book, but while this is part of the Modifius Conan RPG line, it is kind of its own thing. Rather than being based on the original works of Robert E. Howard, this is based on the video game Conan Exiles. And I have no familiarity with that video game at all. And so going into this book, I wasn't sure what to think. Would this be the kind of thing that I would have no interest in or no resonance with? No. In fact, it actually is really awesome and really fascinating. It doesn't compel me to want to play the video game, but it absolutely compels me to want to try a campaign using these rules. So let's get into it and talk about it a little bit. In brief, this is, as the name Exiles implies, this is set in a region and for characters who are disconnected from the rest of the world of Hyboria completely. It is its own thing, is its own setting, and kind of like a settingless setting in some ways. There's absolutely a whole chapter that describes some of the things that are there, but there's also a whole chapter talking about how to do a randomized hex crawl where you just invent the setting as you go through. More specifically, what this is about is rather than dealing with the kingdoms and the nations and the monsters and the people of Hyboria, you are starting with nothing and building a home, a civilization on your own with nothing. And so I assume, based on this book, I assume that the video game is essentially a long crafting-based grind where you're just trying to get resources and build stuff. And in a video game, that sounds horrendous to me. In a tabletop RPG with friends that I like and a game master who is going to be telling a good story throughout, it sounds fascinating, and I am actually desperate to try it. So let's take a look specifically at how some of this works. So we've got in here the characters, and it has, it starts as all of the books do, and if anything, this campaign system, this Exiles system, is harmed by trying to stay true to the format established by all of the previous Conan books. We don't necessarily need these new archetypes. Exile, Forgotten, Shaper, Wasteland Priest. They don't add anything intrinsic to this new campaign style, but they don't really detract, and it's not a problem to have them there in any way. One thing that is never made explicit, and that I assume is an artifact of the video game, is that there are references throughout this book to crucifixion, and I suspect maybe that when you start a new character in the video game, you start on a cross, kind of at the edge of these exiled lands, and then you get down and go off and start a new life with nothing. That's never spelled out, and they just assume that if you played the game that you know it, and that might not even be true. That's just my assumption, trying to figure out why they keep talking about crucified characters. Anyway, after one of the other problems, I should say, with the organizational system is that after you get to the end of all the talents, you get this equipment section. And this is a long crafting section, and this is one of the exciting, cool things, but you don't actually, until much later on in Chapter 4, they don't really explain how to use any of this gear and equipment. So it's good information that is presented kind of in a wonky way. So essentials: in order to craft food, you need 1 forage. In order to craft drinking water, you need 1 water. What does that mean? How do you get 1 forage and 1 water? You have to read Chapter 4 to find out. But what's really great about this is that it is a very stepped, tiered system of crafting and creation. So as you gather resources, you can create new things. So if you were able to get 2 forage and 3 wood, for example, then you have bone digging tools. and all these little things. With 3 wood and 2 forage, you can create a lean-to, and so these are called bare hands builds. Once you just get wood and forage by yourself, and then you can create a shelter, and that's great. Now, what goes up next is crafting builds that you are able, if you get wood and stone, then you can get animal pens and fences and things like this. You can create better clothing for yourself. You can do all these great things. And then what's next? Stoneworking builds and campfire builds. If you have a campfire, that enables you to get some of these other things. And these will grant access to, like, this is one of the things. So, like, if you have stone crafting tools, that is what grants you access to the crafting builds. And if you have an armorer's bench, that gives you access to the armorer builds. And then, what do the armorer builds do for you? There's just all these great new things. There's all these weapons you can create. It just goes on and on. Missile weapons. Here's all the armor that you can do. There's next architecture. And you need all these amazing things in order to build all this stuff. And so, as you can see, what they're doing and the purpose of this campaign system is that you start with nothing and then eventually end up, get to the point where you are building entire settlements for yourself, where you use these resources that you found to craft simple things and then use those to get better resources and craft more complicated things until you have built a fortress or a settlement or an entire civilization based on what you're doing. And so, like I said, we haven't learned yet how to get all these various resources. That comes later in Chapter 4. But you can see the structure of the campaign. It's a very free-form sandbox style of play, where you have your characters and you go out exploring and you're able to find some things. And so the storyline, such as it is designed around acquiring new resources, turning them into better tools and buildings, protecting them from monsters and raiders, and so on. So, there's Chapter 2, which is about the Exiled Lands, and, it's all good information and stuff like that. It isn't as exciting to me as getting into Chapter 4. And Chapter 3 is just, myths and magic and things, and, again, good information, but not as exciting to me as Chapter 4. So we're going to jump into that. Survival gameplay. This is how you are going to find all those resources. And this explains what water is, what forage is, we know what water is, but what is forage? How do we get it? How are we going to go about obtaining all of these things? And then it talks about map exploration. And you can follow this map, and you can read Chapter 2 about the Exiled Lands and use all of those locations and ideas. But far more exciting to me is this idea of the Hex Crawl. This is a very old-style RPG game system. This is the kind of thing that you might have done in AD&D back when you played it in the 80s in junior high, if you're like me. I didn't actually play D&D in junior high, but I did play other games, and we did use this kind of Hex Crawl system. And what this is you will start with what is essentially a blank map. And you've got, you mark where your characters are, and then there is little tables here where you can roll and populate those hexes. And each hex takes up, a certain amount of space, and there's rules for, like, how many hexes can you travel in a day, what kind of rolls do you make to survive and to find food as you go through those hexes. And then you can roll on this chart and say, well, every time you explore a new hex, you roll a d20. On a 1 through 8, it's the same kind of terrain as the hex you just left. And on a 9 through 20, you roll on this table, and it might be something else. And then there's extra things like what kind of resources are present there and what kind of monsters are available there. There are wilderness encounters that can happen every time you go into a new hex. And so it ends up creating this entire story and this wonderful environment, excuse me, that you are creating together with your group as you explore the world. You're finding new things, you're finding these resources, you're crafting them, and maybe you at the beginning are fully nomadic and you're just kind of going out into the world and keeping everything with you. And at some point you've got enough resources that you're like, I need to settle down because I need to build a lean-to or a drying rack or whatever it is, a forge, stone walls. I finally have the chance to start building something permanent. I need to pick the best place for it. But then you still need to get out into the world and explore new hexes and uncover new territory. And of course, as you're doing that, based on these encounter tables or just based on your game master telling fun new stories, you're going to encounter all of these, bad guys, ongoing nemesis or rivals. There's lots and lots of great stuff that you can do. And eventually you get to the point where you are creating your own settlements and strongholds. And there's rules about that. I love this one. No one cares how it is built, even though we want to build it as a sidebar. So kind of the default setting here is that you're not going to spend really a lot of time on the minutia of your stronghold or your settlement. But if you're playing this kind of game, the odds are good that that's what's exciting to your players. That's what the group wants to do, is to decide exactly what this settlement looks like. Where are the towers going to be? How many towers are there going to be? And so you can do both styles of play as you are creating your strongholds and your settlements. And, here we have the much more involved tables. Like if you want to create a frontier fortress out of nothing, these are if you find a fortress that's already there, and what are you going to do to it? What if you create your own? How are you going to build them? How are you going to, what resources do you need, and so on and so on. It's really such a fascinating system and such a fascinating style of campaign to go through and do this. Now, Chapter 6 talks about threats. This is when they have all kinds of nasty monsters and spiders, bad guys, whether they are creatures or people. And then we get back here to Adventures in Exile. This is Game Master advice on how to run this kind of campaign, where the idea that you start with nothing, that you are scrambling for resources. See, here's another picture of some, crucified people. That's probably where they expect you to start. I don't know. Anyway, this is such an interesting, fascinating game supplement that I, am very excited to try. I admit that I haven't played a campaign with this. I've played Hex Crawl games before. I've run Hex Crawl games before, but this new to me idea, where you're not just discovering the world as you explore it, but you are also starting with nothing and trying to build a civilization or an empire, that's fascinating to me. And I would love to do this. Like I said, in a video game system, I know I would hate it. I'm not a fan of grindy, crafty games. But they are a very popular genre, so clearly I'm in the minority there. But also the chance to do it in a role-playing setting around a table or over Zoom with a bunch of people that you like and a game master who is taking the opportunity to weave a fascinating story through the middle of it, that sounds really great. Also, one of the ongoing conversations with role-playing is the importance of emergent story. And this is something that I see all the time as I talk to new players or people who want to play, people who've watched Critical Role and they think it looks awesome and they'd love to get into D&D, but they don't think they can tell a good story. And back in the day, back when I got into role-playing in the 80s, back when a lot of us old folks got into role-playing, story wasn't as big of a deal. Games could be more random and more exploratory. And now there is this incredible focus on story right from the beginning. And on the one hand, that's great. I am a storyteller first and foremost, and I like to do that in all of the games that I run. But on the other hand, it can seem really daunting. It's hard to watch Matt Mercer on Critical Role, who's one of the greatest DMs in the world, and then think to yourself, I can do that, because he does it so well, and he's telling a great story. With Typecast, my Twitch campaign, my actual play campaign, we are trying to tell a really great story. But for someone who is just starting, someone who has watched these shows or has looked at the books, maybe they've seen on Stranger Things the kids playing D&D and they think that looks really fun, the pressure to create an incredible story from scratch is really hard and really daunting, and keeps a lot of people, a lot of young people especially, out of this hobby. And so a game system like this, where you can do what I call emergent story, is a really helpful, handy, wonderful thing. The idea that you can start with no story in mind whatsoever, that you can come to this cold, you can create your characters, and then you can just kind of let the random tables and the quest for resources guide you in the beginning. And over time, as you roll those events, as you encounter things, as situations go very well or very poorly for you, story will start to emerge on its own. Stories and arcs and rivals and monsters will appear without you needing to come up with them by yourself. And that can be such an incredible boon to inexperienced or first-time gamers. And on the other hand, experienced gamers like me who've been doing this forever, the chance to come in and try a game campaign style that is so very different from what I've ever done before is super appealing to me as well. At the end of the day, despite my initial trepidation, the Exiles sourcebook for Conan ended up being my favorite of the Conan books, simply because it was showing me something new that I had never seen before in role-playing, and in a way that is very simple to put into play, to put into practice. So, there you go. The Exiles sourcebook for Conan. I obviously recommend it very highly. Anyway, my name is Dan Wells. I'm an author. Go read all my books. There's links to my website down underneath. My website keeps getting crashed because too many people are visiting it, and we're trying to upgrade that. But for now, go read my books. Look me up on Amazon and buy some of them, and that would be wonderful. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this video. I'm Dan Wells, and you are awesome.